Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks so much for joining us. Sorry, but I can't start without, acknowledging our global situation with coronavirus, COVID-19, and I just wanted to just acknowledge all of the healthcare workers, folks fighting the disease, those that have passed, and just acknowledge the situation around the world before we start. It's a bit surreal to be sort of doing our work, but it's also, when we're at home, it's something that we can do. The other thing we can do is stay home. Just in our little community, we have a law right now that we need to stay at home. We've also been asked to give personal protective equipment to our hospitals so that they have the resources they need. So I guess just please check your local health department and folks to be able to know what it is that you can do to help. But we're all trying to do the best we can, and I hope everyone can stay safe and healthy at this time. Just felt I needed to say that before we jump in. So yeah, I mean, I wanted to just kind of introduce myself and a bit on how I got working on this topic. Working on solid waste as an environmental engineer, I've been doing that over 23 years, and it's really something I fell in love with. When I was studying environmental engineering, we got to pick sort of what our focus would be, and I think to me, working with solid waste really had this strong human component, and you can see lots of pictures of folks that I've met around the world. Many of these folks working on the very, very front lines of what we're going to be talking about today, and I think that's just so critical. But I think about the role sort of that we all play in this when we all make our choices sort of every day, what to buy, what to consume, and then when we produce something that we don't want anymore, it's a discard, but we often characterize that as waste, even though we're trying to shift that paradigm to thinking about that as a valuable material. We all have to make a choice on sort of what we do with that. What do we have the capacity to do with that? Putting it in the trash, recycling, composting. So it's a really, really complex system that we all play a role in. But I think recognizing those young and old at the front lines is really critical, whether they be a part of a formal or informal system. So I also want to jump into some of the research that we've conducted to give some context to this. So why are we so focused on plastic? This was a collaboration with Roland Geyer, also out of the NC's working group that many researchers from all over the world participated in. So we looked at the cumulative production of plastic over time. In 1950, we were only producing 2 million metric tons. And cumulatively by 2017, we had produced 8.3 billion metric tons, a very hard number to imagine. And even when we try to convert it to something that you might be able to imagine it, it's still unimaginable. 80 million blue whales, 800,000 Eiffel Towers. So I think what's important here is then to look at how much of that had actually become waste that we have had to manage on planet Earth. So because a lot of this material had been used for single-use items and packaging, that meant that the majority, already 6.3 billion metric tons, had become waste. What had we done with that waste? Well, as of 2015, we had only recycled 9% of that cumulatively, incinerated another 12%, which is really the only way that we know of that it practically sort of disappears from the planet, of course, as a carbon emission then. But that means nearly 80% had either ended up in our landfills or in our open environment. And these cumulative numbers, at least with the projections that we had seen at that time, are of course projected to grow. So also out of that same working group, in 2015, we published the paper on quantifying the plastic ending up in the ocean. And this was a question that came up within that working group in terms of trying to look at an estimate. This estimate was from municipal solid waste, which we suspected to be a major source of what was probably entering the ocean globally. We looked at 192 countries with a coastline and made the estimate based upon the population density living within 50 kilometers of that coastline. And that was the per person waste generation rate, the quantity that was plastic, the quantity that was mismanaged, which was made up of inadequately managed waste, meaning no formal management system, and then litter itself. So both of those added together made some mismanaged waste. And then the estimates going into the ocean range from 4.8 to 12.7, with 8 million metric tons being the mid estimate. Trying to imagine that number now. If you think of us standing hand to hand along the entire coastline of the world, each one in front of us would have 5 grocery-sized bags filled with plastic, and that's what that estimate equals going in every single year. So if you look at the columns in terms of how much waste or how much plastic we're producing, how much waste we're generating, if you think about decreasing any of those, that's where we started to think about intervention options, which I will talk about later. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge National Geographic for the June issue, which focused on planet or plastic, and for this amazing graphic. So this graphic takes the solid waste generation numbers and the modeling from our paper and combines it with several other papers, many of the papers that had estimated the plastic floating in the ocean, which we know to be a very small percent of what we estimate going in every year. And then also showing the river discharges. There's been 2 major papers that have estimated, at least 2 major papers, Schmidt and LeBrayton, that have estimated plastic flowing out of rivers, which are really sort of the arteries of our land. And 80%, so I'm not going to give the land statistic, but it's actually 80% of land drains directly to the ocean on our planet. And so that's where I think that original number comes from. So now I want to talk a little bit about our expedition, tell some stories, give you some background. So first of all, the Ganges River Basin, we traveled from sea to source. It covers over 1 million square miles, and it encompasses not only India and Bangladesh, where we were, but also some of China and Nepal. So this is one of the most beautiful rivers in the world, had unbelievable diverse terrain, habitat, animals. It's also under stress as the most populated river basin in the world. 650 million people live in the basin, with about 400 million who are directly dependent on the river and its tributaries. It's a sacred and holy river to many people. It's known in India as the Ganga and in Bangladesh as the Padma. At the upper stretch and then near its mouth as the Meghna. And the river discharges a massive amount of water. Silt and sediment, it's reported to be as much as 38,000 cubic meters per second. So the river itself is used for many, I think, what have seemed to be, vast and never-ending resources. But many of those are stressed already. It's also currently used as a solid waste management system by some who live directly along that. We witnessed some of that when there are no other choices of taking waste away. And before plastic was even in our waste stream, right? This would have totally different implications now that there's plastic. Depending on those 2 references I mentioned, the river is ranked either 2nd or 6th in the world for plastic inputs into the ocean. But this was all completed, of course, with modeling similar to our work, with estimates going into the ocean and compiling some empirical data that had been collected in various areas around the world. So for us, our goal was to actually collect empirical data. So we worked directly in collaboration with many in-country partners in both India and Bangladesh, who wanted to really know the flow, low, and characterization of plastic pollution in the river basin, as well as search for solutions. So we designed the first ever Nat Geo Sea to Source expedition and executed this in 2019. So let me take you through a bit of the journey. So after a practice of a trial run in April 2019, We began in May at the mouth of the river in Bangladesh in a community called Charfishan. The river is wide here. It's about 11 kilometers wide, heavily impacted by the tides. I would say, in fact, our boat, which I'll show you some photos of in the future, it often felt like we were on a nearshore ocean instead of the river itself. And the flow and discharge of the river here is massive. Like I said, frankly, a bit incomprehensible when you can't even see the other side. Charfishan was a small rural community that relied heavily on fishing for livelihoods and sustenance, which was a common theme on much of the river. In Bangladesh, we traveled by boat. So in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you're going to see our first section there that we traveled. So we traveled by boat to each city or village. And so next was Kanpur, which was an industrial city with a lot of boat traffic and some beautiful sights as well. And the last city in Bangladesh is Rajbari. From there, we had to fly to Kolkata to cross the border and then drive to the first site in India. So we completed the whole main stem of the river, but in order to get across the border, we ended up flying. So the road trips of our caravan of vehicles were sort of epic throughout this whole process, although we also took the train. One of our favorite things to do on our road trips, though, was to guess how long it would take to get to our next stop, which was often 3 to 4 times what it would take for us to travel the same distance in the US. As an example, but the sights and experience were absolutely incredible. So in India, our first site was Savganj, a rural area that was both agriculture and fishing based. Patna was next, and this was where we could take a train, which was great. Patna was our largest city we worked in on the journey, has a full 2 million people, but this is still a very small city for India, but definitely a very large urban environment. And then our next city was the holiest of cities along the Ganga, Varanasi. We witnessed ceremonies of gifts to Namami Ganga, and that in some cases were released directly into the river, but some were also natural. And that's one of the things that folks are really thinking about, and how religious ceremonies can impact the river as well. Varanasi, after Varanasi was a small rural town called Kanaj. And this was the first time I had ever seen large cornfields in India. So I'm from Minnesota, a state in the US that has lots of cornfields. And I even took some photos and fooled some of my friends in terms of where I actually was. They thought I was in Minnesota. So next was Anup Shahar, somewhat smaller and our smallest population city that we visited within India. And then we went to Rishikesh, which is a well-known and touristy mountain community that many visit for river rafting and mountain hiking, as it is on the edge of the Himalayas. You can see we're getting into the Himalayas. And finally, the last site, was near the source of the Ganga in Harsal, 10 hours up into the Himalayas by car and just south of Gangotri, the town named for the glacier that is the source of the river. So here's our photo of part of our team. We were never sort of all completely there together for various reasons. People came in and out, but this was at the end of the second expedition. We have 5 countries represented here, an incredible interdisciplinary and truly international collaborative team. I need to give a shout out to my co-lead, Heather Coldaway from the Zoological Society of London. So here's a photo of her actually back at Nat Geo Explorers Fest presenting while we're in the field. So Heather and I were able to actually job share this lead position, which was an incredible opportunity to be able to balance sort of our work and home life situations, and really, really grateful to Nat Geo for that, and Heather as well. So here's the boat I promised. Here's the boat that we were on in Bangladesh. Really, really simple, but a great and steady riverboat. And I would say the hardest part about the time, especially on the first expedition, was the heat. So really, really hot in May and June within Bangladesh and India as well, but really, really challenging to stay cool and manage a team in those conditions. But everybody did incredible. So we we sort of have our research split up into different components in this, and I'm going to go through a little bit in each one. So this is the water component, and we sampled, or the water team, so sampled surface water, sediment, and then dredge sediment for macroplastics. So the surface water and sediment were sampled for microplastics within the river system as well. And then we also sampled air. So on the pre-monsoon, so the spring expedition, and maybe I'll back up quick so that people know we did 2 expeditions, one May through June and the other October, late October through early December. So we sampled air as well, and there's Imogen Napper and Sananda who are working on getting those air samples. So lots of really a holistic approach in what we were doing there. And then here's some of the team at the fish market. So that's Emily Gausia and Heather, who are trying to explore what types of fishing are done, what types of fish are consumed, what kind of fishing gear is used, because that's actually a big component of some of the plastic that we think is entering, as well as telling a story about how the plastic is impacting what's happening in the river. So here's a fisherman showing how much plastic is ending up in his net as he works to fish in the river. Here's team members who are working to do a survey of what nets and net pieces are ending up along the riverbank as well. And that's Sarah Nelms that you can see working on some of that. On the land side, which I can talk a bit more about, which was the section of the team that I also led, we used a protocol that we developed here at the University of Georgia called the Circularity Assessment Protocol. And this came to be as I was visiting communities around the world working with the State Department on environmental diplomacy, and also as the circular economy became sort of the term, the thing that was going to sort of save us from this, which certainly if we can get there, I think it can. But what does that really mean? I think what's been really challenging for folks is to say, what does that really mean at the community level? What does that mean we really do? And so we thought about how we can look at a community from these 7 components, and that would be input of a material. In this case, we're looking at plastic into that community, how folks use, interact with it, what's the level of awareness about that material, how products are designed, what type of use and reuse we see within a community, how much of that material is actually then collected. And we separated out collected and end of cycle, which would actually be similar to management, because even if you have management scenarios, but you're not collecting your waste, it's still going to end up in the environment, and or vice versa. You could collect it and not be able to manage it properly. And then finally, a leakage component to see what we see ending up in the environment currently. And all of this is sort of driven by policies that we see within communities, the economics, and the governance. And then we have our influencers, which includes all of us as citizens, those in academia and industry, government, and many incredible NGOs. So this is part of some of the data collection, again, in collaboration with all of our in-country partners, and especially for us, we had community level partners who could help us just even talk about some of the culture and social norms that, of course, influence sort of what we see on the ground as well. And so that was Catherine, who gave a webinar last week about Marine Debris Tracker, and that's what she's using to collect this data. Sorry for the slide switching. I know that there's a little bit of lag with that. So here's Amy Brooks, who also gave a webinar last week from the team and from my research group. She did the research on the import and export of plastic scrap globally. And then here's the data just on the Marine Debris Tracker website. So this is data is open and accessible, of course, with usernames and some privacy components removed. So you can see our track and the data that we collected. Also, as I mentioned, we were looking at sort of the input and use of plastic in these same communities. We had curious faces all the time, folks engaging and wondering what we were doing. And so it was also really a part of being able to talk to, engage with the community and have, I think, awareness raised just from us being there. And even get assistance sometimes with our measuring wheels and things like that. But also going into shops and talking to shopkeepers, what are your most popular items sold? How are they packaged? Here you can see traditional packaging for a food item consisting of leaves, but then also in the other picture you can see some of the sachets, a very common item that we saw, but there's also eggs there that aren't packaged. So just a combination of what type of packaging, how are people getting the food and products, and how are things different in each community. We also did a deep dive into the informal sector. So in Bangladesh and India both, there's a huge informal sector. So folks that really aren't, it's not funded by the government, they're really entrepreneurs. And in many cases, this is the one way that they have to be able to make money. So we're trying to explore that at what's called the kabadi wallas, the junk shop owners, the folks that are buying some of this. So doing a lot of interviews and talking with them about what they're buying, what is valuable, and we wanted to look and see how does that compare with what we see ending up on the ground, right? So what type of packaging is valuable enough that these folks can buy and sell, and what does that mean? So we had an amazing socioeconomic team who was working within villages that were near these communities as well to really sort of understand from the rural component. These were located very close to the river. Our partner, the Wildlife Institute of India, already has an amazing network of folks called Ganga Prahari, their community river protectors. And so they helped connect us with these community, and there was a lot of household interviews for folks on how and why they use plastic, and then how they manage their waste, and the needs and concerns that they have, as well as focus group, and then some engagement with some of the kids. Here we had done a marine debris tracker little contest with groups of kids in terms of looking out in the environment to see what was on the ground, which is not something that the folks in these villages often do, and they often don't have anywhere to put their waste. We also did some tech, so I think this was really cool. Al Davies, a colleague of Heather's, and various collaborators, we designed and came up with a bottle tag, so both cell phone and satellite GPS signals that can be tracked, and to try and figure out really how far does something travel when it's dropped in this river basin environment. Of course, where we have dams, they're not able to go past that. So we put them in at various stages, and definitely near the end of the river to see how far something would go. In terms of the land sampling data, we did this based upon population density. So we have an algorithm. We use land scan population density and targeted areas for sampling each city. As I described earlier, just from going to the city, they have their own personality. Well, they also have their own litter personality or profile. And so then having that data sort of immediately to say what are the most common items found here and why. I think the three main questions as we collect this data that I encourage people to think about are: what is it? How did it get here? And what should we do about it? And sort of those three questions sort of drive this data collection. And here's some results to be able to kind of see what we can do with this. This is litter density, so this is all items, and then some of the other sort of potentially influencing factors that we map along with this, including stores and waste bins, various components within the community as well. So that's sort of data collection. Let me talk about sort of an intervention framework, like how do we move forward? What can we do about this? And this was a framework that I developed when I had to first testify to the U.S. Senate in 2016, but it's sort of stuck in terms of I took that original input of plastic into the ocean graphic and then thought about, well, if we lower some of those columns, can we lower and reduce our input, of course, to zero going into the ocean? And what does that do is open up all these different places for intervening and reducing that all the way. And I'll talk about these from detail, but what I was just talking about was litter collection. And what has been so important about being able to collect that data is that then it can inform those upstream solutions. So let's talk through some of this in a bit more detail. So first, all the way upstream. So consumer choice, which I'm very careful, I think, to caveat. This is a luxury for many people to be able to have these choices. I know that all around the world, people don't have choice of access to clean water. They have to buy bottled water, cannot afford some of these choices. So these really are luxuries for a lot of folks. And having just testified again to the House lately, compiling the US data, the largest plastic waste producer in the world, we are in the US, one of the highest waste producers. We are folks, those of us that do have this luxury, can reduce our use of plastic, single-use plastic, within the US. And so these choices, they sound mundane, you know, we've said this many times, but taken collectively, especially when I'm doing these modeling projects and looking at these numbers, they absolutely do make a difference. But I think not only your individual choice, but being able to tell others. So that's how you make it this collective movement, right? And we see this in many cases going on, many NGOs and folks engaging people, making policy changes as well, of course, can impact this realm. Also, there is the potential, I think, for industry to hear our voices and make changes themselves. So second, how can we get products to folks but not produce waste in the first place? So can we decouple waste generation rate and from economic growth? Both of those have been coupled through time. They don't necessarily decouple until much later down the development path. But I think getting creative, using technology, doesn't have to use technology, but simple, you know, things going back to reuse that we used to do, some of those practices, but I think moving them forward with the way our society operates now, things like RFID, reusable containers, and then the home shipping, but even just a local community bulk store, you know, that really reduces both your plastic footprint and your carbon footprint, being able to do that kind of shopping. So, but if we do have packaging, we're not going to be able to necessarily get everything. We need to be thinking about our end of life at our design stage. That's why we're talking to the recyclers. What does have value and why? And, you know, how would we change things so that everything had value? Because what's ending up on the ground and leaking out of the system is really what doesn't have value. And that's both in an informal and formal system, right? So thinking about how we design these things so that they can be this kind of design parameter here means these bottles can be recycled bottle to bottle because they're not using toxic adhesives. There's consistent use of the types of plastic. A deposit return scheme shows 40% reduction of what, so it also produces a value even beyond the material itself on a container. And so thinking about things like that to make sure the material is valued and doesn't end up in the environment. Alternative materials. So, you know, some of the materials before we used plastic, I talked about earlier, but now we have folks researching, my colleagues, Jason Laughlin, head of the New Materials Institute, researches a polymer called PHA. From my perspective, I think these materials, we need to look at the current infrastructure for managing our waste. So we don't want to be looking at using materials that don't also fit into what we have, or we need to figure out if we transition our infrastructure over where these materials can fit into that waste management, whether it be recycling or biodegradability. In this case, PHA is a polymer that acts and behaves like plastic, well, but yet does biodegrade. Now, of course, lots of caveats there. We may get lots of questions, but it of course depends upon the microbial activity. Different than PLA, where it has to reach a certain temperature for hydrolysis. It will biodegrade without that, but it still depends on the consortia of microbes that are there. The ocean compared to the soil, compared to home composting, are very different. So we have, I think, the most array of respirometers in the world. We have, let's see, 60, 120, 132 respirometers where all these materials are tested in different environments and various products and things to make sure that they do behave as the desired concept or the desired environment degradation. So waste management infrastructure. So even if we change products and materials, we need to manage our waste, plastic or not. I've seen lots of situations where organics are also can be an issue. So this is a whole integrated waste management approach. I keep the terms a bit general here: collect, capture, and contain. Because this looks different all around the world. These are different sites. I'm so amazed. I've been able to visit about 28 countries where I've seen the waste management practices firsthand. And so I've got two more C's: context and culture are incredibly important. And when folks say, what should we do here? I say, well, your context and culture better than me. Let's talk about how that fits into this. And if we can spark some thoughts and bring some ideas, but waste management is such a localized thing in the U.S. as well. Every state is different, and then of course every community can be quite different, and that's part of the complexity and challenge as well. So, considering this informal sector that I referred to in India, folks work within this all over the world. And as we're thinking about moving forward with solutions, being inclusive to this community, these are experts. These are people who are leaders on the front line. They know this issue, and including their knowledge in a collaborative and inclusive way, and the designing an infrastructure that they can continue to participate in I think is really important. Thinking about communities that simply don't have anywhere to manage their waste. So how can we address that, where they're just imagine you don't have a trash can at your house, there's no dumpster in your community. What do you do? How can we work together to address that? And then the independent entrepreneurs. So the first slide was, folks pick through waste at the landfill once it gets there. We also have worked with the independent waste collectors in Ho Chi Minh City, who work the tiny back streets there, collecting waste directly from people's homes and then sorting that. But there was tension between them and the government, because they needed somewhere to put their residual waste, and the government was upset. And finally, an agreement was able to be made. They're providing a service. They need to be recognized for that service. 4,000 of these independent entrepreneurs work within Ho Chi Minh City, but it's a struggle, and they don't have the resources that they need to function. To places like Taiwan, where I go to the MRF and the recycling, there's 17 categories of what is recycled, and the recycle truck and the garbage truck travel around the city, and residents come out of their homes when they hear the music, and they bring their waste material, and there's 3 or 4 staff that help them determine where to put the recyclables. They have both used food waste and raw food waste that go to 2 different places and then put their trash themselves actually into the garbage truck. But this is a very sort of engaging. People stand out and socialize as they're waiting for the trucks to come. And there is almost zero litter on the ground within the city. Actually, there was zero. I didn't see any. And so I think part of our disconnect of our material is that we can just put it in a bin and it goes away. This sort of engages people that they realize, you know, there is sort of no away. So at the last chance, before we get to the ocean, we can capture the material with, here's the famous Mr. Trash wheel. You know, love him, an engineered, very simple but engineered system that collects what's floating before it gets to the ocean. They collect data, as well as the many, many years of cleanups that have been happening. This is not our first choice, right? This is sort of how it used to be. It's like, well, let's just clean it up. Now we're doing all of these other interventions upstream of this. But what I mentioned before, that becomes critical. And Ocean Conservancy has run the largest international coastal cleanup for over 30 years now, is collecting the data. So Marine Debris Tracker, which is what Catherine Youngblood talked about last week, is the mobile app that we're now using for all of the National Geographic work. We have a great long-term sponsor now with Morgan Stanley. But this is open data, citizen science, a really great empowering tool for folks to continue to collect data even after we leave, and folks are using it opportunistically to collect data around the world. So also on the expedition, circling back to that, we held workshops, solutions workshops, workshops to teach how to use Marine Debris Tracker and how that can continue to collect data to inform solutions for the community, education, components. So we had folks designing curriculum and going into schools and teaching students about how they also can participate and engage, which I think is just a great way to empower the community to think about solutions moving forward. So I just want to say, well, thank you to the amazing team that I worked with. Thank you to everybody around the world for welcoming me and our team and our research group into your communities. And this was absolutely, you know, one of the most incredible components of my life, I think, in terms of being able to participate and work with so many people from around the world. But in the travels that I do for National Geographic and the State Department and our research work, I just meet so many people working on this issue on the front lines, doing incredible things. And I think it's important we share their stories and really understand what's going on. So I want to thank all of those people and all of you for your participation today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Jenna. That was great to hear. Everyone, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box. And just to mention the two colleagues who Jenna mentioned, Catherine Youngblood and Amy Brooks, they presented webinars last week, and those are available on our YouTube site. Just a question in the meantime, Jenna.
Yeah.
You mentioned the alternative materials plastic, like the PHA and the PLA. In your opinion, would those work long term, or would it be an issue in terms of resource extraction and in terms of its end of life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that those are all important things to think about sort of the whole picture, you know, holistically. What are we using? So in I can just speak a little bit. So in Georgia for the PHA, they use canola, which is grown on fields as they're sort of resting from some of the other agriculture that they do here. So they're trying to be very thoughtful and not be, you know, consuming land that would be used for food. Other types of organic substrates can also be non-food items, but of course there is the agriculture component. I don't necessarily know, I don't think there has been a full holistic sort of the life cycle of that extraction versus Well, of course. I mean, obviously, again, not producing waste in the first place. So let me just go there. Not producing waste in the first place is the absolute best thing you can do environmentally, not having to manage any material at all. But I do think sort of as we look at, especially if we can get a handle on managing our organic waste, I already think we don't do that very well. Managing our food waste as is, much of that goes to our landfills where it creates methane, where of course we have been able to create landfill gas to energy, but it still is pretty challenging to capture that. Composting would be much better. So, I mean, if we can do that, I think there might be some of the packaging that would very much make sense to be also biodegradable, where PHA could biodegrade, but you have to think about additives and the various blends that usually happen to make polymers. So that's why so much testing is going on in that space. And so I don't think we have quite the answer to the question that you're asking. At PLA has been sort of the challenge here in that it has to reach these temperatures for compostability, and it's been challenging for many of the existing compost systems to manage at this point. And corn has been the major substrate, which also has had some challenges. So those are great questions that need to be discussed out in the open. Okay,
Thanks,
so
Jenna.
I should, yeah. So
I see we have a question from Willem saying, hi everyone, thanks Jenna. Did you identify any cases of upcycling in communities on your expedition? Cases which developed organically where persons identified an opportunity for using waste?
yeah, definitely. So just a couple quick examples. I know in the village, the folks often use plastic bags to twist and make rope. And then they were making like like the nets that hold mattresses for their beds. Lots and lots of creative upcycling. I would say even the larger HDPE containers at places we went near the river, people were cleaning those out, and people collect river from the Ganga and take that home as the holy water that it is. And so they were reselling those for much more than the value of the container itself for people to use to collect water. Those are just two very quick examples. But yeah, there was a lot of reuse and things like that. Okay, do you want me to just go to the next one?
Sure. We just want to read them out for the preserve for the recording. Sure. So there's a question from Isabel saying, hi Jenna, many thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask a methodological question. Which technique would you think is more suitable to analyze microplastics, for example, microscopy, spectroscopy, or gas chromatography?
Yeah. So I think, so just let me say, not as a microplastic person. So, I mean, I think I sort of attempted to go into that space when I sailed across the ocean for X Expedition, which was also an incredible experience, and brought samples back, was able to look at those, but we used FTIR for some of that, but there's also Raman. I think the biggest problem we had, we did get a morphology 3D ID, which was great. So sounded great. Scanning the filter for count and size of particles, and then targeting with Raman spectroscopy. But we had a lot of issues with fluorescence. And then with that automated system, some of the larger pieces would actually cross the grid, which was how the camera automatically counted. And then it wouldn't actually count those because they were crossing grid lines, which was also challenging. So I think, anyway, for me, yeah, that was challenging. But I would say there's definitely other folks that probably have stronger opinions on that, who work more closely within that field. I mean, Chelsea Rockman and others. So, but that was my experience. Obviously, I think right now, where the science is at, you need to identify polymers. So Imogen Napper, who's leading the analysis at Plymouth, along with Richard Thompson of the microplastic from our expedition, is using FTIR. You have to be identifying the polymers. We're probably even going to do that with, so we also took samples of all the product wrappers that we got to be able to make sure we know what polymer is what.
Hi, Jenna. There's a question from Nina saying, what percentage of flexible multi-layer sachets did you find on your trip to India?
That's a great question, Nina. So those were definitely in the top, and I guess you would probably call the tobacco sachets as the multi-layer. So absolutely, that was what I would say the biggest problematic material. But top items were often food wrappers and the tobacco sachets, which are also which are the multi-layer.
There's a comment from Jonathan saying, do you have thoughts on multiple border policies in government regarding waste management with large rivers?
So, I mean, I think we've seen some great, regional approaches from multiple countries, and that's been great. I mean, just even when I was at the first African Marine Waste Conference, which I'm so sad that the second one was having to be postponed, but the Azerbaijan convention, if you think about the marine litter action plans, I think so we've interfaced a lot with the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. So these are not riverine environments, but I'm saying these groups have multiple countries coming together. So all the countries that border the Pacific with the APEC are addressing this issue together. So absolutely, multiple governments, if they can engage, then you can share lessons learned. You can, come together to pool resources. And, rivers don't know political boundaries. Our ocean doesn't know political boundaries. I think it's absolutely critical for folks to be able to work together on this. And I see a lot of good happening in that space.
There's a comment saying, thanks for your wonderful presentation. And did you have a chance to explore the ways the different stakeholders in each country are addressing plastic pollution, especially microplastics, in their formal education system?
That's a great question. So I showed at the end, we had an education team that was interfacing with some of the schools. And I would say, as far as I know, there wasn't much at all happening. So these, I mean, I outlined some of these communities. These were small cities and even village communities within these countries. And as far as I know, there was not any formal introduction of this as an issue to study yet. And so this curriculum that was developed by the in-country partners and with collaboration with folks also from our team and some National Geographic was the first time that they were introduced to that.
There's a question saying, do you have any comments on the industry's response or responsibility to restore communities that have been devastated by waste overloads?
That's a great question. So one thing when I was talking about packaging design at the top of this, I had extended producer responsibility. When I first started traveling and seeing the communities that, literally have nowhere to manage their waste, I think about the companies and the responsibility. And I don't, like how can these products be distributed when we know there isn't anywhere for them to manage? Yet at the same time, I know they talk about the desire for these. And so I think I mean, I just, it's hard for me not to know how they can't feel responsible. I think what I think of when I see companies that are wanting to help, they're not always sure what they can do. And so I think part of that is getting worked out through this process of talking about what solutions can be. But of course, companies want to keep, selling their products as is, and I think that has to change.
There's a question from Ravi saying, I presume your team must have come across different types of plastic. Which category of plastic was the most common in each area, and how would you explain such patterns?
Those are great questions, and which are being sort of analyzed now. I mentioned some of the multi-layer material that Nina brought up. So that was a very, very common material that we find. It's light, it blows. Tobacco sachets, I don't even think people think of as waste that needs to be managed properly. And again, as I said, there with the informal waste sector, with things of value really only being what are collected and then therefore managed, those don't have any value. So, so I can talk to that now, but you're absolutely right. The profiles of each community are going to be different, and then potentially how to address them will be different, and the situation there. But there will also, I think, be very much similarities, that there can be lessons learned across.
There's a question from Jacqueline saying, will you be undertaking any research expeditions to Malaysia anytime soon?
Potentially. It's actually one of the APEC countries that that group of countries are ones that I've been working closest with in terms of one of the regional collaborations that I described, and there is potential, I think, because of that work that we've already been doing.
Thanks so much. If anyone wants any more questions answered, please type them in the box. I have a question, Jenna. Do you know if there's been, obviously since the plastic issues become more worldwide known and known more commonly, do you know if there's been any studies done on the sale of cigarettes and things like that? Because that's often one of the issues in terms of the packaging and the cigarette butts that are found on beaches. Do you know if any studies have been done highlighting that?
And you studies on where they're distributed, or where it leaks out and what leaks out?
Well, those, but also if there's been any decrease in the volume that are sold and produced due to its environmental impact.
Yeah, I don't know. It is one of the, I think it's the most common, right? Either the cigarette butts, and from what we saw, tobacco sachets. But I don't really know of the production levels and sort of what the trends have been over time. That's a great research question. So thank you to everybody again for tuning in, and thanks so much for hosting Sustainable Seas.
We do have another question, sorry, from Grigor saying, which responsibility do you allocate to the packaging industry in different countries or in general? Can you estimate the likelihood of major improvements regarding the ocean pollution through addressing industrial stakeholders more rigorously?
Yeah, I think that gets to that extended producer responsibility question. I think they need to be at the table, and they need to be informed on what can be done. I mean, they're a huge part of the stakeholder process that includes the community, citizens, government, and industry taking more responsibility.
There's a question from Peter saying, if you were to revisit your previous study that highlighted the top 20 polluters, do you feel the list could be different, given some of the countries have disputed the numbers attributed to them, informed by in-country studies or assessments?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've had change over time since then. China, Indonesia, various countries have, as we said they should, go into their own data, collect the in-country. I mean, the goal of that paper was that global input number was not about ever for me pointing fingers. But because we were very transparent with how we did that, then those numbers were there. And that means that people went and collected better data, which is also what we need in this space. There's been a huge lack of good data, and we really can't measure or manage, or we can't manage what we don't measure very well. And that's one reason why we collect the kind of data that we do holistically from land, water, and in the communities. And I think that countries have realized that that's what also needs to be done. So I have actually welcomed all of that data collection and correcting. I would love to do that study differently if we're going to concentrate on country level data. I would love countries to report their own data and be able to compile something like that. I mean, really, the World Bank put out their What a Waste 2.0, and so a lot of that data is now there. So I've been get all questions all the time. Is this going to be updated? I would say there's new work coming out from Succinct that is going to look at future modeling, and I was a participant, but really led by Steph Burrell and Chelsea Rockman at Toronto, that has some different scenarios that's going to have some new numbers within that paper as well. But I get that question a lot, and I never my intention to sort of surprise countries with that. It was, and so I would just do it very differently if I was able to update that.
Thanks, Jenna. There's a question, do you have some plans to upgrade the subject of EE in education curricula in the countries that you mentioned? And if not, do you have any suggestions for a way forward?
Yeah. So hopefully, because there was that collaborative work, again, with the in-country partners and National Geographic, we're hoping that some of that can be sustained. You know, that's why we worked with the Wildlife Institute of India and IIT in India, and then in Bangladesh, the University of Dhaka Wild Team and Isabella Foundation. They now have those resources and can hopefully take some of those forward within the schools and communities there. But we continue to interface to help with that as well.
There's a question saying, how can we get access to the Debris Tracker app? We are currently monitoring marine litter inputs around the Mauritius Island.
Yeah, you can just go to the App Store. If you, even if you just put in Debris Tracker, Marine Debris Tracker, either iPhone or Android platforms, it's free, open, available. The website, probably just if you Google Marine Debris Tracker, that will show you, because it's marine debris .engr.uga.edu. But you can also just go to Twitter there, Debris Tracker, which is on the screen right now. And if you need a customized list, and also just go back and watch Catherine's webinar as well, and you'll get tons of info. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of Nat Geo explorers using it now, making their own videos, posting on Twitter on how to make story maps, analyze data with students. Tons and tons of teachers, Nat Geo education folks are also using it and engaging their students. It's really been a tool that's taken off lately, and we're really excited for that. So you can get in touch with me or Catherine if you have questions beyond what you can kind of find out there on the interwebs.
Thanks, Jenna. That's great. And yes, the webinar that Catherine presented last week is available on our site. So she then discusses how you can get it and also where you can input your data, and shows you how to use it. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. Thanks, Jenna. I don't think there are any other questions. So a big thanks to everyone for joining today, and we really appreciate it. We'd love to stay connected with you, so feel free to follow us on our social media to find out more. Thanks, everyone.